and actually run a Medicare bill. The tax plan in last year's budget was, I think, about 1 page, not even 1 page. There's a lot more heavy lifting than a 1-page tax plan, and I think Republicans could do ourselves good by actually striking out, providing some leadership, outlining what a real pro-growth tax policy looks like, and actually passing it through the House. Same way with Medicare and other entitlement reform. If we're going to save and secure Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, it's one thing to have a paragraph in the budget. It's another thing to actually pass things on the floor. And I think it's time that we actually took that chance and put out what we're for in a detailed manner, because these are very serious times. It's not about games before the next election. It's games with our creditworthiness long term.
I think it's important to point out that one of the reasons leadership may be able to shorten the years to balance is because of the recent tax increases. So it's not just a structural change in what we're doing. It's that there have been tax increases. So if taxes were lowered again, then that might change the picture. And I think we haven't been given enough assurances that once you reach the balance within 10 years, that you stay at balance or near balance, and don't just bounce off the bottom and go back up to deficits. Because it's possible you could balance at year 10 and then have deficits going on until year 20 or 25. So it's important to understand those structural issues.
Could you address the president that you saw yesterday? And do you think that Republican leaders right now are in a position where they should be accommodating the president and just trying to temper his agenda, or just standing as a bulwark against him and saying no?
Unfortunately, I think our strategy right now is to play rope-a-dope until 2014. And I think we need to go on the offensive and stand on our principles. No spending happens unless it's approved by the House. And I think we need to be ready to stand firm on that. So I wouldn't take a defensive posture. So he's very bold in his statements yesterday.
Mr. Labrador, we were lonely without you.
Well, it's good to be here.
How many of you actually didn't listen but actually just read the president's speech? If you sit and read it on paper and try not to hear it in his voice but just read the words, in many ways I've heard that exact same speech dozens and dozens and dozens of times from hard left activists. It sounded like every standardized left-wing speech. And if you start to dice it, okay, if you're after social justice, well, damn it, a job, a growing economy is social justice. Not trying to manipulate a society, not trying to move for a collectivist society. And so there are fairly radically different visions here of what creates freedom, what creates that social justice, what creates that opportunity. And I think we, as the conservatives, as those who are defenders of freedom, have to constantly be pushing. Even when we're running against that brick wall, we just got to keep running into it until eventually we knock parts of it down. Because heaven forbid, if this president were to get his vision of the agenda, what would this country look like 4 years from now?
Yes.
Siobhan Hughes with Dow Jones and the Wall Street Journal. Could people talk a little bit more about the tax component of the Republican agenda? When you talk about tax reform, what components do you see?
One of the nice things that has some of us enthused, and you'll actually hear Chairman Camp actually being much more vocal, I believe, at least this is what I'm hearing, that they've spent 2 years holding hearings and collecting information about what a much broader base, lower rates, a lot less, sorry to throw some acquaintances under the bus, lobbyist-created carve-outs, special extenders in the tax code would look like. And why do we want to embrace such a thing? It's because that maximizes economic growth. If we're the party of economic growth, we need to blow up this tax code. And it's becoming part of our common discussion now that this needs to be the year where we radically change the tax code so we can actually start to grow this economy.
Siobhan, what was the last part of your question?
I was wondering what you think the components are.
Well, one thing that was discussed at the retreat and Republicans have been discussing since the early 1930s is the issue of Wall Street versus Main Street. And clearly in the last election with our candidate, the Republicans still look like the party of Wall Street when it was both parties that bailed out Wall Street. But in my book, any tax policy has to deal with Main Street, has to deal with families and small businesses. But the difficulty I think we have going in is I think the American people are also looking at the last tax policy that just passed, kept all the carve-outs and the extenders and all these special tax provisions from folks who had lobbyists, who all mainly had connections to Wall Street. And Republicans said all along for 2 years we didn't believe in that anymore. And so I think it's high time we bring out a policy, bring out and have a full debate on the floor about all these handouts and all these tax subsidies. And gosh darn, I'm going to be fighting for Main Street. And the president's been able to position himself that way, even though he voted for all this, sign that bill with all these handouts. And again, I really believe if we want to get the economy growing again, it doesn't start at Wall Street. It starts out at Main Street in America with small businesses. And the Republicans have had difficulties with that. I think Washington's had difficulties with that because this town, everybody says they're for small businesses, but then they worry about Boeing. And they worry about a wind subsidy for $12 billion, and they forget about the small business impact. So that's one goal I have, and I think it's a party-wide goal, or it should be, that Republicans should be the party. That's our history, standing for the small guy, not the guy on Wall Street.
You guys are talking about, you're putting pressure on the Senate, obviously, to pass a budget, but you're also talking about deepening the cuts in your own budget. What gives you the confidence with a smaller majority in this climate that budget could pass with only Republican votes? And on a broader level, what is the risk and what is sort of the fear that we've seen lately where it seems like the Republican majority simply cannot pass bills on its own?
Well, the premise of your question is false. We have been able to pass bills for 2 years out of the House of Representatives with just a Republican majority. The issue that we need to address in our conference is what we talked about at the retreat, and we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks, is that we need to start governing from a conservative perspective. And I don't know what everybody else said about the deal that we're going to do tomorrow, but I'm actually okay with what leadership is doing right now because they actually have an agenda. The agenda is to get to balance in 10 years, to have a balanced budget, not just to pass a budget that balances in 10 years, but to actually achieve balance in 10 years. If you look at what we're going to do, we're going to pass a 3 or 4 month extension of the debt ceiling. We're going to pass, then we're going to get into the sequester, and we're going to hold the line on the sequester. This is the promise that our leadership is making to us. And as long as they keep that promise, I think many conservatives are going to be okay with that. Then when we get to the debt ceiling fight, we're going to ask for, at a minimum, the one-for-one cuts that comes from the Boehner rule for any long-term debt ceiling extension. So if we look at that, it means that in 10 to 15 years, with very little help from the Democrats, we can actually achieve a balanced budget, which is much better than even the 23 to 27 years that the Ryan budget gave us, and it's obviously much better than the never balancing budget that Obama and the Democrats have proposed for the last 4 years. So you look at all the data out there, all the public opinion polls say that the American people think we're spending too much money, that the American people think that we are taxing too much. But the problem is that as Republicans, and I think this goes to what Representative Huelskamp has been just said, as Republicans, we have been seen as the party of big business. And we should never be the party of big business. We should be the party of individuals, a party that helps individuals have a fair share. We have a system that is unfair to small businesses, to individuals. We have a tax system that is unfair. We have a regulatory system that is unfair. And when Republicans once again start